to welcome you to today's webinar, Leadership and Development, Expanding Your Emotional Intelligence. I'm going to hand things over to our featured presenter today. She is an executive leadership coach, Erin Cambier. Erin, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Marianne. I am really excited to be here today to talk about the concept of emotional intelligence. We are going to learn about emotional intelligence as well as how we can apply that in the workplace. There we go. Slides are moving. Okay, a little bit about my background and why I'm here to talk about emotional intelligence. It's an area that I'm extremely passionate about, and I've worked with clients individually as well as guests today. We're going to talk about the key areas, the key competencies of emotional intelligence, help you understand why emotional intelligence is so important for you to learn, how much it contributes to your personal and professional success, as well as learn a couple things to be able to have some takeaways by the end of this session that you can apply immediately to enhance your emotional intelligence and your communication skills. So we have a poll that I believe Marianne has built, and she'll show here shortly. So you can go ahead and weigh in about your knowledge level of emotional intelligence. If you have studied emotional intelligence significantly and you are regularly working on your growth, maybe you have some basic knowledge of emotional intelligence and know that you're utilizing some concepts from time to time, or if the idea of emotional intelligence is something that's brand new to you and you're excited to learn about it, go ahead and vote on that one. So select that, and then Marianne will share the results.
All right, I'll give everyone a minute here to answer. And so far, Erin, right now, about 49% of our attendees, they are new to the concept of emotional intelligence. We have 45% who have a basic knowledge, and the last 6%, they have studied and they're working on their growth in their own emotional intelligence.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And the awesome thing about emotional intelligence is no matter where you are on that spectrum, you're in the right place today, number one. And number two, you can learn and continue to grow it. There is no arriving at, I know everything about emotional intelligence and I've perfected it. There is just constant, consistent growth. And once you learn about the concepts, you then get the ability to apply it and continue to learn how to enhance those skills. So let's first talk about what in the world is emotional intelligence. In simple terms, emotional intelligence is just basically being smarter with your emotions, with your feelings. Our emotions are data, and they help us process and understand the world around us. And so just like other data, we have to gather it and we have to accurately use it. So emotional intelligence helps us become more effective in utilizing our emotions to serve us and our behavior in positive ways. I like to give the example in describing emotional intelligence as think about your high school valedictorian. This may have been somebody who was the class brain, a straight A student. Maybe they seem destined for success. And now I imagine that whether you graduated last year or 20 years ago, if you were to go back to your high school reunion, the people that seem destined for success may or may not have actually achieved that level of success that we felt like existed because of their book smarts. Typically, if you look at an overview of each person where they are today, you might be quite surprised. There are likely a few people who have gone on to achieve extraordinary levels of success professionally and personally, leading companies, just in overall just world changers. And those people may or may not have been just the top students in the class. Sometimes their stars started shining when they went out into the real world and they were able to apply those skills. And history is full of this, people who may or may not have been great students, but went on to make a huge impact, leading companies, etc., leading fulfilling lives, really. And so that's the difference, is that we've heard the difference between book smarts and street smarts. The second, more intangible one is really where the idea of emotional intelligence has evolved from. It's the idea of putting that it's much more than just intelligence, but it's applying our emotions to be able to help us drive our behaviors for success. We're going to talk much more about this. So the power of emotional intelligence. Let me get my slides caught up. There we go. So becoming competent in emotional intelligence, in other words, improving your emotional intelligence, helps you to everything from your personal to your professional life. Improve your moods, communication, problem solving, even your ability to handle change and navigate through challenges, as well as managing stress. All of these things are rooted actually in our emotional intelligence. So you are using your emotional intelligence today, whether you know it or not. You have been using it your entire life. For many of us, it's the awareness piece that allows us then to understand it and to be able to manage it. So a little history, we're not going to do too much of a history lesson, but a little history of emotional intelligence. It was initially introduced in 1985. And I love sharing this. The gentleman who introduced emotional intelligence, his name was Wayne Payne. Which is perfect, right? So he coined the term emotional intelligence, but it didn't actually become well known until the 90s. In 1995, Daniel Goleman released his first book called Emotional Intelligence. It became a very, very well-known book, and Daniel Goleman continues to be a world-renowned speaker and author. He's released several books since then about the topic of emotional intelligence, and he is someone who specializes in brain and behavioral science. And when he initially released this book and had studied the concepts of these brain and behavioral sciences and how much they impact our success, what he did is really put a memorable label onto a group of interpersonal skills that are really standard for everything that we do today. To summarize the thinking behind the emotional intelligence model, we learn patterns of our emotional behavior in our childhood. And I always joke when I lead courses, like, I'm not going to have you lay down on the couch. You know, we're not here to talk about childhood feelings, but it's important to recognize this is actually where those pathways form in our brain. They are neurological pathways, and they just form kind of waves in our brain. In other words, they're patterns that we use to respond to situations. Our brain uses them to then interpret things logically and decide our behaviors. So we will always have emotional responses. It's in the wiring of our brain, it's science. But learning emotional intelligence is in effect incorporating alternatives to our childhood responses in the way that we process its reactions to these emotions and to our perceived threats. Okay, intelligence for success. So I like to include a little bit of kind of the whys behind emotional intelligence. And I love statistics, so I pulled a couple in here that I would like to share. So research shows time and time again that having a high IQ does not automatically translate into job success. Brilliant people can be stunningly poor leaders or unsuccessful in terms of their own lives. Brilliant people can also be amazing leaders. It comes down to a multifaceted view of intelligence. So brilliant people are people who combine emotional intelligence as well as IQ for success. So how much impact does emotional intelligence have on your professional success? The short answer is a lot. Emotional intelligence has been shown to be the single biggest driver of success in the workplace. And according to the book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, by Bradbury and Graves, emotional intelligence is the foundation of our success, as I mentioned. They tested emotional intelligence along 33 other important workplace behaviors. They found it actually supersedes almost all of those behaviors, including things like time management, even communication, and decision making. In other words, they found it was more important for success than some of those areas. I have clients all the time who will come to me and say, I want to help my team improve their communication, or I want to be able to communicate better. And we can work on communication behaviors, but actually at the core of that is emotional intelligence. And when you work on emotional intelligence, as a result, many other positives will come about, typically also improving your communication, time management, and decision making. In the book by Bradbury and Graves about emotional intelligence, they found that it accounts for 58% of performance in all types of jobs. They found that, again, it's the single biggest driver of success and the strongest driver of leadership and personal excellence. The awesome thing is, as I mentioned at the beginning, no matter where your emotional intelligence is, you can improve it. And I would also add, you should continue to improve it. Because again, we don't arrive and say, okay, I've got communication down, relationships, I've arrived at emotional intelligence. It is something that we should always be working on. In a couple of statistics I included in this slide here, according to their studies, 90% of high performers are also high in emotional intelligence. Perfect reason why we'll want to improve our emotional intelligence. They also found, it's not in this slide, but 70% of low performers are low in emotional intelligence. In other words, you can be a high performer and have low emotional intelligence, but as you can see by the numbers, the chances are very slim. And according to their book, people with high emotional intelligence actually make more money. They found it down to very specifically an average of $29,000 more a year than those with low emotional intelligence. And according to Bradbury and Graves, every point that someone would go up, if you're measuring it, and you don't necessarily have to measure it and take an exam, but there is, tools to do that. Self-assessment is a great tool, though I suggest even without points. But every point that you would increase would specifically add $1,300 to an annual salary. They found that these results were true for all people in all industries and all regions of the world. In other words, they said, we cannot find a position that emotional intelligence is not tied to their success. All right, so I'm sure you're on board with, okay, now how does this work? How do I improve it? So let's talk a little bit about how emotional intelligence works. All of our emotions are derived from 5 core feelings, and they're listed on the slide here: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, and shame. And now that doesn't mean that all of our emotions are only in one of those areas. Many times it's a combination of several of those. But as we move throughout our day, we are subject to a constant stream of emotions and reactions. You're even having an emotional response right now, though likely it's mild. I imagine you're not extremely worked up, or maybe you are extremely joyful to be here today. But we're constantly experiencing this stream of emotions. Whether we're aware of them or not, they're happening. Everything that we see, smell, hear, taste, and touch travels through our body in the form of electric signals. They enter the brain in our limbic system, and this is where our brain processes everything first. After that, they travel through our frontal lobe before they get to the place where rational decisions are made, and this is also known as the cortex. Now, we're not here for a science lesson, but what is important to note is that these two areas of our brain, our limbic system and our cortex, are in constant communication all day. And the communication, the place where these two come into interaction is actually the physical source of our emotional intelligence. But emotional intelligence is exhibited through our behaviors and other things that we're going to discuss today. So it's important to note everything that happens to us first processes through our limbic system, which is the place where emotions are produced. So everything happens to us emotionally first, and then it enters our cortex, where our reason has the ability to kick in. We can't stop the emotion. We can't change the way that our brains are wired. The purpose of emotional intelligence isn't to say, I'm never going to feel anger again, I'm never going to feel sadness again. It's not. It's actually to acknowledge and recognize it, and then use those emotions to help us make great decisions as we move forward. Here's an overview of what I shared. Just to review that, first, it happens in our environment and is processed through our emotional brain. And then second is where our logical brain kicks in. And you may have experienced this, again, without knowing, but when you're in a situation where maybe you think logically, oh, I shouldn't be stressed right now, but you notice your heart is racing, or maybe you're sweating, or your blood pressure is going up, and you're working hard to try to manage that. Well, what's happening is your body is reacting to some perceived threats in the environment. Those emotions are happening. And then if you're saying to yourself, okay, I don't need to be worried in this moment, then that's where your cognitive brain is kicking in. So that's your emotional intelligence working in that situation. But most of the time it actually happens physically first, and then secondary, we have the ability, of course, to react with our cognitive brain. Whoops. Okay, so here's an overview of the 5 key components of emotional intelligence. And these were identified by Daniel Goleman and have been studied and released in numerous books since then as some key areas to not only measure emotional intelligence, but to focus on for growth and learn about what makes up emotional intelligence. We're going to go through an overview of each of these and talk about what they are and specifically how you can work to improve them to be able to then impact your emotional intelligence. The first area is self-awareness. And emotional self-awareness is truly the foundation of emotional intelligence. Because when you have it, self-awareness makes all of the other elements and components easier to use. Obviously, what you don't recognize, you can't manage. So if you aren't aware of what you're doing, how it's impacting others, or even how it's impacting yourself, you can't change and improve it. So if there's only one area where you're going to work on in emotional intelligence, it has to start with self-awareness. And I also like to share that self-awareness is not about discovering some deep, dark secrets about yourself. Now, that could be a good tool in that, but specifically when we refer to self-awareness, it's really about developing an honest, straightforward understanding of what makes you, you. People high in self-awareness have a high understanding of what they do well and where their strengths lie, as well as what motivates them, what satisfies them, and what people or situations trigger them. So this means that people who are high in self-awareness also understand what they do wrong. And self-awareness means that we don't use that awareness to produce shame or to beat ourselves up. It means that we utilize that awareness to learn and grow. As self-awareness increases, it's also important to note that study after study shows that people's life contentment skyrockets. In other words, you're going to be in general happier and more content with your life the more self-aware that you are. Self-awareness is also so important that 83% of people who are high in self-awareness are also top performers. The second key competency is self-regulation. Self-regulation, as we have listed on the slide, there is your ability to manage your emotional responses and choose the best behavior in any context. Again, remember that we're processing everything first. We're processing it first emotionally. And then secondary, we're processing it logically. We have the ability to apply conscious thought and action after our emotions have triggered inside of our body. So this is why emotional self-awareness is so critical for success. Because if we can't take our emotional temperature, then we cannot, as here listed in the slide, self-regulate. And in that case, then we're at risk of behaving in an angry way or belittling or a critical way when that may not have been our intentions. So we have to be conscious not just of our behaviors, but specifically of what we are feeling and the impact those feelings have then on others, on our behaviors, etc. Self-regulation is essentially not letting that emotional brain rule. Some people refer to this as our primitive brain, because in many years ago, we had to be able to react immediately to potentially save our lives. If there's a saber-toothed tiger chasing me or lurking up on me, I have to be able to perceive that threat, react to that emotion, and take action immediately. So we still utilize those emotions for positive purpose. Today, it might not be to save our lives from saber-toothed tigers, but it's important to note that we cannot avoid having the impulses. What we can do is notice them and choose to react differently to them. This takes practice, of course, but it's a powerful skill to develop. So let's talk about motivation, which is the third key component. Personal motivation can be displayed through your self-determination. It can be displayed through a commitment to positive thinking and also ongoing mental strength and fortitude. It's important to note when you read that description, hopefully you've read that already, is that motivation isn't just about your ability to self-motivate. More specifically, it is self-motivation when things aren't going right. When you failed, you're disappointed, and you're emotionally hurt. What is your ability to push through that situation? that ongoing mental strength and fortitude that you have to get through when it doesn't seem like you can get through. That's a key component of emotional intelligence. We'll talk in just a moment about some of these key areas and more specifically some ways to improve them. But we're in the awareness piece and kind of learning what makes up emotional intelligence. Empathy is also a critical key component of emotional intelligence. Goleman's study of emotional intelligence really brought this word to the forefront for the world as well as specifically for the workplace. The application of empathy enables enhanced collaboration, better communication, better group facilitation. You can lead better, you can coach better, you can resolve conflicts better. As we know, empathy really is the cornerstone of any strong organization. But as we know, empathy is so much easier said than done, right? We can go in and think, okay, I'm going to be empathetic, or, I'm an empathetic person. But whether it be distractions happening or multiple people needing us at once, or just being so busy that we can't even notice what's going on around us, we have to intentionally slow down to be able to apply empathy. Take a moment to think about what makes it hardest to apply in the workplace. And typically it's because we are so busy. We are on our phones, we have multiple screens open on our computers, someone comes into our office and I may not even stop typing. I do try personally to stop typing, but just giving an example, you may not even stop typing to notice their body language or some of the tone in what they're saying. So if we can slow down and really open ourselves up to receive the messages that other people are trying to send beyond just the words they're saying, it allows us to apply empathy at a much greater and much more successful level. Another thing to point out with empathy is that it's much easier to apply empathy when we understand people as individuals, as people. Rather than just being someone who is there to help us accomplish our to-do list, when we get to know who they are, what drives them, a little bit about who they are as a person, we're able to be much more empathetic and understanding and apply that on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so the last key component, the fifth area, is our social skills. Our social skills are our ability to socialize with others in a complex social environment. Sounds like a complicated description, but a huge myth about social skills, this category, people think, well, if someone has good people skills, they have good emotional intelligence. You're either born with it or you're not. And the great news is that is a complete myth. That is not true, that you're either born with it or you're not when it comes to emotional intelligence. And specifically in the area of social skills, it actually is much more complex than just having good people skills or just being good at socializing. Social skills help build strong networks. People that have good social skills develop the overall culture of the organization. They understand hidden context. They understand politics, not necessarily politics in terms of government, but just how things work in an organization, who to go to and when, and how to involve people and what's the best way. All of those things brought together is defined with the term social skills. So as you think about someone, typically it helps for us to, when we think about emotional intelligence, to, I like to imagine someone that has good emotional intelligence skills. And the best example that I like to give is think about the best boss that you've worked for, or your favorite mentor, someone that really was an engaging leader for you. And think about what made them successful. Why were they a good leader? Typically, as you think through this list and you're hopefully naming off a couple things in your head, in 20 years of doing this, I've never heard, well, they were a great leader because they really could enforce policies well and they knew how to meet the bottom line, or they could write great policies, or whatever that is. Those are things that are more black and white. Most successful leaders, the things that make them successful, are actually a list of emotional intelligence skills. Their ability to coach, train, develop, motivate, collaborate, make you feel engaged, empowered. Those are all emotional intelligence skills. Book smarts are important. Their ability to meet the bottom line was absolutely important. Probably their ability to enforce policies was absolutely important, but it was not exactly what made them the impactful leader that they were. They had to meet the bottom line, but actually emotional intelligence allowed them to meet the bottom line and to be able to make a positive impact. And that's applicable whether you're in a leadership role or not. Oops. So I skimmed through that super quick, but you can learn emotional intelligence. I'm going to go through some key things that will be some takeaways that you can apply in terms of learning emotional intelligence. It's important to note that emotional intelligence can't be learned fully in a 1-hour webinar. We're definitely doing a high-flying overview. We go extremely more in depth. We have a 3-day course or else custom 1 or 2-day courses where we can go much more in depth. In the 3-day course, we go, deep dive into practicing real life application, learning these strategies, doing some self-assessment, learning new tools, but you'll definitely have some things that you can walk away with after this webinar as well. So learning to be emotionally competent requires a different approach. Rather than intellectual learning, this type of learning takes place in the neocortex. In other words, it involves whole brain thinking. Because I talked about everything happens first in our limbic system, which is a part of our brain that's different than where we make decisions in the cortex. So as you can see, we have to be able to utilize both parts of our brain to be successful in emotional intelligence. And in learning emotional intelligence, there is no step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. It is completely different than learning to build a PowerPoint presentation where, it's very clear, it's black and white. We have to find our own path of development, emotional intelligence, because our emotional responses are deep-rooted. They've been running since childhood. These patterns are already there. So you have to find what works for you, ways that, and understand the ways that you're interpreting situations, and then be able to essentially kind of retrain your brain to be able to interpret those situations and respond in new ways. So as you might imagine, this takes time and practice, and that's where that ongoing commitment to mental strength and fortitude will absolutely be something that will serve you well, because as you grow in emotional intelligence, you will also grow in many other areas that will affect your performance. So here is a slide with some tools about developing your self-awareness. As I mentioned, this is really the critical and most important step for you in terms of growing your emotional intelligence. It is the foundation of strong emotional intelligence. So it really requires stepping back and starting to look at, what are my behaviors that are happening every day, and specifically, what are the emotions that are driving those behaviors? Look at your emotions in your daily interactions. And I like to call this your self-awareness radar. And what's great about self-awareness is that all you have to do is say, you know what, I'm going to be more self-aware today. And right there, you've put up that self-awareness radar and you've started just trying to be more aware of not only how you're impacting others, but how others and situations are impacting you and your emotions. So in the course of that, you'll better be able to identify your triggers, and then you'll better be able to develop a plan about how you can be more honest with yourselves or others to help you develop overall maturity, character, confidence, and emotional health. A couple of other good tools and tips for developing your self-awareness are in this slide. I love the concept of conducting a survey. If that's something that works for you, it can be a completely informal survey. There's many that you can find online and just put your own together, free, easy, simple. But most specifically at the core of that is ask for feedback. Ask others in your life, what could I do to make our relationship, to improve our professional relationship? How does my leadership impact you? What could I do to better communicate with you? Just really specifically looking for, don't just ask them yes or no questions, and don't ask very general things because you likely won't get specific answers. So ask specific questions about your behaviors, ask them for honest, constructive feedback. Also, it's important to note when people are starting to focus on their self-awareness, think about the people that you are asking. Be strategic in who you're asking for feedback, especially in the beginning. If I always joke, if I were to ask my mom, can you provide me some feedback about the way I deliver a presentation, for example, what would she say? Oh, Erin, it's so perfect. It's great. Don't change anything. You do everything exactly how, it should go. That's probably what a mom would say. So make sure that you're asking someone who will speak truth and who isn't just there to, make your ego feel good, but specifically, will give you honest feedback and give them permission to do that. You could even say, I'm focusing this year on improving my emotional intelligence. And so in the course of that, I really want to get some honest feedback from people that I trust. What's something that I could do to improve my effectiveness as a professional? Or if you're working on meetings, to improve my effectiveness in meetings, or whatever that is. So ask for feedback. As in the course of that, you can also start to recognize and record your emotions. In other words, look for those physical changes. Note, whenever I walk into a meeting with so-and-so, or whenever I go into this situation, I'm noticing that my heart is racing, I'm sweating. This is an indication that my emotions are probably in a different place than that calm, content place. And so I worked with a client specifically who was having consistent issues in a certain meeting and dynamic. And once we dug down, we talked about his communication, we talked about what was happening. Once we actually dug down to the core of that, it was actually an emotional response that he was having before he even walked in that door because of something that had happened to him in a previous workplace that then changed the way that he perceived everything that was happening in the meeting, which also impacted his behaviors, which then resulted in that we say to ourselves, this is going to go bad, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then it actually goes bad. Because we have set that intention for ourselves. So getting down to the root in self-awareness helps us to be able to impact that in positive ways. It's also important to note, don't judge your emotions. There is no good or bad emotion. As we looked at that slide earlier, you might have noticed that happy was the only positive, was what I often hear. Happy is the only positive one on that emotion. So if I'm feeling angry or shame or any of those things, I don't want to have that, so I'm going to stuff that. But emotional intelligence is not labeling anything as good or bad. Emotional intelligence is actually recognizing those emotions exist for a purpose. And they exist to tell us something. We cannot control them. We cannot stuff them. If we stuff them, we're not using them in a healthy way. They will come out in an unhealthy way later. So what we can do is lean in, embrace and understand our emotions so that we can then control how we behave by using those emotions in a positive way. When we ignore an emotion, we miss an opportunity actually to do something with it. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. Many of us have heard this phrase, and it is so true, and it is a key part of emotional intelligence, that recognizing that what others are saying to us is beyond the words they're saying, and also that recognizing that when we are communicating, we have to also think about the other things that are impacting this communication. Many people like to think that emotional intelligence is just on the inside. And much of that is true, but emotional intelligence is actually reflected typically in our outside image. So everything from how we appear physically to our tone, if someone is upset, their tone is likely going to be different. Their body language is going to be different. So if you are an employee who every day walks in, kind of bent over, looking down, and you're in a good mood inside, but your body language, and you're not looking at people, and you're maybe just monotone responding and not saying hello or good morning, even if on the inside you think this is a great day, your body language is not exhibiting that. And so what happens then is people are thinking, oh gosh, this person's having a bad day, what's going on? And that actually might impact their communication with you. And many things can come as a result of that. So just note that your body language, your tone, your pitch, everything about what you do impacts that communication. It impacts the messaging that you give out to the people that you work with and around. So what you want to do is use your emotions during the conversation. Knowing what emotion you're exhibiting or understanding the reason for that emotion is not enough to manage your emotions. Managing your emotions is a conscious and active task. It does not mean getting rid of the emotions. It means using it in a positive way. In other words, you can use anger to propel you to, maybe I am really upset about a goal that didn't get met. And I'm a part of a team that didn't meet that goal, or my team, I'm leading the team that didn't meet that goal. I can decide, I get a choice then. I can use that anger to go in and let the team have it and, scream at them about how, they should have made that goal and it's unacceptable, which hopefully, as you know, would not be that would be letting our primitive brain rule. Or I can use that anger to propel me into maybe having a tough conversation in an honest, straightforward way and letting the team know with, very intentional messaging how important it is to get to that goal and getting them rallied and on board. If we stuff the anger, it actually may allow us to not even have that conversation. Maybe like, well, yeah, they didn't meet the goal and we'll do better next month. So all emotions serve a purpose, and they can make our lives and professional success better if we use them effectively in our conversations. A really good way to help you use those emotions is to engage with focused listening. It's really truly listening to what they're saying and not just their words. And this sounds like common sense, guys, right? How many times do we hear, you need to be a better listener? But truly, this is a very important skill in emotional intelligence, and it is a skill that is seldom mastered. I've been teaching about emotional intelligence for many, many years, and it's something that I still consciously have to step back and focus on and do as a listener also, because typically when we are listening, we are multitasking. We're listening with one part of our brain and we're preparing a response with another. And you may have experienced this, and it's painfully obvious when that person is checking out of the conversation and not listening. And not only does it make them appear uncaring, but it also can influence the direction of that conversation and its success. So whether you're in a leadership role or you are a contributor, strong listening skills are really critical to your success. Hearing what someone is saying, as well as understanding the message behind it, is what's most effective, rather than trying to think of how you're going to respond. Really listen, pause, and then think of the response afterwards. So asking good questions is, of course, another great skill to help you improve your communication skills and your emotional intelligence. Asking probing questions shows that you're listening. It shows that you're engaged and that you care about the topic. Many times there is potentially at the root of this maybe a bit of a pride or ego thing for us. We think, well, I'm supposed to know all the answers, especially in leadership. I'm supposed to not, everyone that comes to me, I should have an answer for them. But I'm here to hopefully dissuade that myth that no matter what your role is, you are never expected to know all the answers. And when you ask good questions, it actually makes you a more impactful leader. And when you answer honestly and say, if someone asks you a question, you say, you know what, I don't know that answer. Let me check on that and get back to you, rather than, coming up with a quick answer. You'll actually be much more impactful in your leadership. Okay, let's talk about our emotions and our behaviors and how interconnected they are, and how we can use our emotions to drive our behaviors. So as I've already talked about, our emotions and our behavior are connected. But what's important to note is that while we cannot choose our emotions, we can choose our behaviors. So consider for a moment what happens when you drop a stone in the water. That stone sends ripples through the water in all directions. And our emotions are just like that in our whole life. Our emotions send ripples in all directions. They do that regardless. We can't change that. We can't drop a stone in the water and say, well, I'm going to change it so it doesn't leave ripples. It's just going to happen. So we have to choose what kind of stone we're going to drop and when and how powerfully, and then choose, because it's going to make an impact no matter what. So let's say a manager or even a team member is frustrated and loses his cool or her cool in front of the team, and specifically on someone else. So they're chewing out this person in front of the group. People leave that situation and they might think that the person who's been chewed out is the only one impacted. Now, while they may have felt that stone directly, that ripple effect of that stone is actually impacting all who witnessed it. As people are wandering back to their desk, the others start to feel that impact. They're starting, what's the first thing we think about when that happens? The first thing I always think about is, when am I next? When will my number come up? How can I avoid that situation? And make sure that doesn't happen to me. They might feel frustrated, feel less engaged. The manager may think, okay, my rant worked. It scared people straight. And short term, everyone might fall into line better. They're worried. They don't want to make the manager mad, so we're going to do exactly what he says. But ultimately, we're human and we're going to make mistakes. And to perform at our best, a team needs to take risks. A team needs to stretch themselves. They need to get out of their comfort zone. They need to feel comfortable making mistakes along the way. And for effective collaboration to happen, a team has to be willing to stick their neck out and do whatever it takes. So is this team who has felt the ripple effect of this angry manager in this one situation going to be someone who's going to take risks, going to be wanting to stick their neck out and take a chance? Probably not. So that manager, likely, they won't necessarily feel the immediate impact, but the long-term impact will be that he will be leading a team that is not willing to take risks, doesn't collaborate well, doesn't feel the ability or have the ability to communicate well, and isn't taking initiative. And so ultimately that manager is going to feel that significantly in terms of his team's results, but he's determining, short-term success or long-term success. So I want to encourage you that your emotions are powerful weapons. Watch how closely they impact people immediately and use those weapons for a powerful impact, for positive ripples that you can make in your organization. You can use your emotions to facilitate your thinking. And this is just a high-level overview. I'm going to share more on the next slide. But most of us are controlled by our emotions and are not yet skilled at using them to our benefit. In fact, studies show that about 1/3 of us are actually able to accurately identify our emotions when we have them, and 2/3 of us are typically controlled by our emotions and are not yet skilled at using them to your benefit. So choosing to be in a good mood means that you cannot necessarily choose what happens to you. You can't choose your emotions, but you can choose how your behaviors in terms of how you approach that situation. You can choose to make positive efforts to show that you're going to contribute in positive ways to the team, even though you may be feeling angry, even though you may be upset. You have control over your behaviors. We cannot control what happens around us, but we can choose how we respond to it. And here's a toolkit in doing that. Expanding your emotional intelligence requires you to learn how to live in the moment. It really just means shut off autopilot. No more Groundhog Day every day. Most of our days, we're going about things in the same way. We set our alarm for the same time. We set our phone or alarm clock in the same place. We wake up to the same noise. We drink our same cup of coffee out of our same cup. We go through our same morning routine. We drive the same way to work. We do all of these things on autopilot. And expanding your emotional toolbox requires us to pay attention, be in the moment, and recognize the fact that we are making choices throughout the whole day. So being in the moment first requires you to notice, shut off autopilot. Notice how you're thinking, feeling, reacting. What are some of those messages, patterns that we're hearing? What are the things you're thinking about in the morning that we're hearing in our head? I always joke, we talk about voices in our head. Well, it is true. We all talk to ourselves. And if you think that you don't, you probably responded and said, no, I don't, which is a perfect example of we all talk to ourselves all day. So noticing what are those things that we're saying, how we're experiencing our world, then enables us to be able to choose. Embrace all the feelings and accept them, and then choose how you are going to think and approach and act in that situation. You have a choice for how you act, how you feel, and you get to decide, am I really using this moment for the best? And then contribute. Decide, what am I going to give out in this moment? Am I contributing or am I taking away from this environment? This applies professionally, but I'm also going to use an example that I say frequently to my kids, are you adding niceness or are you adding meanness to your environment? And it's so true, right? We might think, well, I'm not consciously adding either. But if you're not consciously adding one, I can promise you, you are still adding one. It's just happening by nature. It's just happening by default. And many times if it's happening by default, it may not be with intentionality. It may not be with that level of, kindness or intention in terms of adding to your environment that you would want. So the purpose of our emotions is to help us gauge our environment and use that. You've heard me share that all emotions are valid. And while that is true, it does not mean that you have the right to have an emotional response whenever you want. The reason we call it our primitive brain is because, when we're 2 years old, we throw a fit because we're upset and emotional. And that allows us to get what we want. But now, when we are beyond 2 years old, we can't just follow those emotions. We have to recognize those emotions and use them for purpose. Here's the stats about letting our emotions drive us or not. 61% of employees say that they've let their emotions get the best of them in the workplace. And then I also pulled in the second statistic because it's interesting that 86%, almost all people say that when a coworker or boss loses their cool, it does impact their perception of that person's performance. So take note. What you're doing, how you're interacting is impacting the people on your team. So before deciding on a path to take as you're approaching that situation, you have to assess it. Take the time to understand the context, understand your emotions, and decide, is this worth doing anything about? How will it impact me or others? Is this a battle that needs to be fought? The overall goal is to be effective when dealing with issues. So make sure that you know what you're getting into before dealing with that specific issue. Meaning, what is going to be the ripple effect of your actions and your choices? Sometimes it is worth the, going to battle for, and sometimes it's like, no, I don't need to win that battle because more importantly, I need to win the war, which is, you're not in war at work, but the war of making sure that you're making a positive impact. It's hard work, guys. It requires intentionality. And so being able to assess that situation, take a step back. Practicing a pause is one of the most powerful tools that you will be able to use in emotional intelligence that exists. The moment you pause, you take your emotion, you take yourself out of the equation, and you put a pause on your emotional response. Hopefully it gives you some time to be able to cognitively decide, what do I want my behaviors to be now? And then be able to, make a wise decision as you're behaving. But many times, just practicing that pause will allow you to make a reasonable decision rather than one just based upon emotions. I created for myself, sometimes I have a 2-hour rule that if I have an email or just a situation that's really emotionally charged and it is not pressing, that needs to happen right now, I make myself wait a certain amount of time to give myself, because we want to react right away, guys. Most of us, that emotion is not just going to drive us, but it's going to drive us to take action. And that can be used in a powerful way. But if it is driving our behaviors and the emotional responses coming out, it's probably not the powerful way that you want. So think about setting up some ways to help you assess, practice the pause, and then be able, to utilize that in the workplace. So as we've talked about, having emotions is just a part of being human. We cannot stop them. Understanding our emotions and learning how to use them is the responsibility of each of us. Many times I hear the workplace is no place for emotions. I go to work and I don't have emotions. But it's just honestly not, it cannot happen. It's science. You cannot go to work and not have emotions. So the truth is your emotions must actually be utilized. And when they're utilized in a positive way in the workplace, that is what will help your success as a professional and a leader. So here's some good next steps for getting started, some tools to help you in your development of emotional intelligence. Many of these things are rooted in self-awareness, because as you can see, once you have self-awareness, then you can develop that true growth plan. So think about asking for feedback, potentially leverage assessment tools if that works for you, or getting a mentor or a coach who can help you and speak truth. And then as a part of that, develop a growth plan. I cannot stress this enough. All of our courses, all the students that attend, we talk about specifically not just learning information, but developing a plan. You guys, if we don't have a plan, we don't have a timeline. And if we don't have a timeline, all we really have is a dream. And growth doesn't happen through just dreams. Growth happens with a plan. And so as you want to grow your emotional intelligence, write it down, develop a plan, create some ways to assess it, apply what you learn, get more feedback, maybe even start coaching and mentoring others as your next level of success. Okay, so here's an overview of some of the key topics we talked about, as well as the more in-depth topics that we go into in the 3-day workshop, where we discuss, much more in terms of self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation. We really talk about identifying some of those blind spots that we have, because we all have them. If we say we don't, then we're probably not having good self-awareness. So we have blind spots, but they're called blind spots because we don't know that we have them. There are things that we're making an impact in, and we don't even know that we're making an impact. Maybe that's positive and maybe that's negative, but being able to identify our blind spots and then create a growth plan in that is one of the most powerful ways to truly advance your emotional intelligence. So we have a couple minutes left. I would love to hear questions that you have. So we'll open it up for Mayanne if she has any questions in the chat, or anybody wants to share questions.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'll give everyone a minute or two just to type out any questions that may have, but just a quick reminder to everyone that we are here to help provide knowledge and prepare all of our students for certification. And when it comes to their leadership and professional development, we have courses that are currently scheduled on a website that tie into everything that Erin's been talking about in regards to emotional intelligence. So please take a look at that. If you are interested in the material that's presented on this webinar, or if you have any other questions regarding what's available to you, please make sure to contact your local center for more information. You can log on to newhorizons.com and do a zip code search to search for the center that's closest to you. Also, as a quick reminder, I know we had a few questions that did come in. The session is being recorded, so we will make sure to send out the recording to you once it's over. And we make sure that you check out your email and make sure you keep a heads up for that. Sorry, my words are stumbling today. A couple questions did come in, Erin. The first one is, how do people who think of emotional intelligence as a negative thing change their thinking to it being an opportunity? Some employees need it, but sometimes I think it's a bad thing. How do you manage that or kind of turn that around to change their thinking?
Oh, great question, because I have seen this frequently. They think, well, I'm in trouble. If I need to go to the emotional intelligence course, that must mean there's something wrong. But that's, or if this person's suggesting I read a book or learn about this, I think the best way is just educating all of your team about emotional intelligence and about how, honestly, top performers also need to grow their emotional intelligence, because don't we all want to be more successful? The answer to that is typically yes. So if we all want to be more successful, one of the best ways we can do that is to improve our emotional intelligence. And if we give that message to our entire team or share that frequently, then it doesn't become such a feeling of like, oh, this person's targeting me. Now, maybe you're in a leadership role and you can effectively and respectfully give somebody some honest feedback and share with them, here's some things that reasons why I think emotional intelligence would help you. And if it's viewed as this leader wants to help me be more successful, then it's much more embraced. And the more people learn, like, no, emotional intelligence, just like emotions aren't good or bad, that's also a huge myth. Emotional intelligence isn't necessarily, if you need to improve it, it's not a bad thing. I need to improve it. We all need to consistently improve it. It requires, going through training or learning about it just enables you to have intentionality and how do I improve it to be more impactful. hopefully that helps.
Great. Another question that came in is, how do you help executives understand that even they can benefit from gaining some more emotional intelligence and supporting it from the top down?
Ooh, I love that question. So I think that's very similar to the one the answer I just shared. But the more awareness we bring to how emotional intelligence impacts leaders specifically, we will be more effective leaders when we are able to understand emotional intelligence and how to utilize it. Executives, now it depends upon your role and what kind of influence you have. There's obviously some other social dynamics and workplace dynamics that take place. But the more people learn, especially I love sharing statistics about emotional intelligence and how it's tied to performance, especially leadership performance. And whether they're executive or a new leader, we all can learn and grow, in that area. And when executives, any type of training, when an executive participates in it, they're automatically giving a message to the team that I'm fully on board with this and embracing it. And this is something that I believe in. Even executives that have like I have several executives who are honestly really, really good at emotional intelligence. They still come through the course because not only do they continue to learn, but they also impact that ripple thing I talked about. They're impacting, people positively in that way. So I would suggest there's, a multitude of reasons why it would benefit an executive. Hopefully that helps.
It does. Someone had a great question here. They were actually curious about your educational background because the question is, what major, when it comes to education, is most beneficial in being able to learn and present EI material?
Oh, great question. So honestly, I love this question because I don't think it matters what major or background that you have, because emotional intelligence comes from a different place. In other words, we don't improve our emotional intelligence through our intellect. And our degree or our major is typically driven from an intellectual place. So not that there's anything wrong with degrees, there absolutely is. My bachelor's degree is in communications. So it's related to emotional intelligence, but just became an area for me that I continue to study and get advanced knowledge in over the years. So I believe that absolutely anyone can share on this topic. In fact, all of you could go share on this topic to your colleagues and even your family. Once the more that you learn about it, the more that you can share about it.
Great. And a lot of good questions coming in here. You had mentioned pause. How do you manage this when you're in the middle of a situation such as a meeting and you do not have a ready opportunity to pause?
Okay, good question. I've seen a couple of different strategies work. If you know that it's a meeting where there's a history of the example I gave earlier, it was just a history of there seemed to be conflict frequently. I actually suggest having a discussion with those key people outside of the meeting environment and saying, you know what, I recognize that we probably, and I'm sure you do too, we probably haven't been the most effective at getting to problem solving during our meetings. And I own my part in that. I would love to help us purposely work towards that. Even though we can't control other people, remember, all we can control is ourselves. So something I would like to incorporate is when we feel like things are getting heated, one of us can just be like, let's take a 2-minute, compile our thoughts. And it kind of prefaces that and creates that safe situation for either party to be able to allow, practice the pause in the moment. But otherwise, I also suggest sometimes that maybe you haven't had that conversation and it's just getting to a place of uncomfortability, that it's either, sometimes it's okay to say, you know what, guys, let's take a 5-minute break, especially if you're leading the meeting. And other times it might be, let me think about this and get back to you. We want to respond right away, but it might need to be, we can think about it and get back to them. If you have to reply in the moment, then I want you to just give yourself permission for silence and tell yourself it's okay to just say, when they ask you something, just say, let me take a minute to think of the best way to respond. And literally just take a minute and take some deep breaths and, do the best you can to start some of that. I have some kind of certain things I'll say to myself to help, work through that, and then, obviously embrace the situation. So just a couple of ideas there.
Great. And I know we're at the top of the hour, but we have one more question that I'll squeeze in here. Any tips when you are aware that someone has a specific behavior that triggers you?
Ooh, okay. I love this question also. So it's important to remember that we can only control us and we can't control other people. And most of the time when there's something that's triggering us, we want to make sure they know to stop that behavior to stop triggering us. I'll give an example. Last night, my husband was doing something that was not intentional. It was like, oh my gosh, he does this all the time, and this is so annoying, frustrating. Maybe it's triggering you to a different place other than annoying. But regardless, we all have these behaviors. I had to consciously, rather than go to him and say, can you stop that right now? Because you're driving me bonkers. And I love him to death. And I annoy him. I annoy other people. It's just who we are. We have to control ourselves. And I had to recognize, is this a battle? Is this worth saying anything about? What will this contribute to making our relationship better? Will it impact it? And it was like, no, this is not a big deal. I'm going to try to embrace this noise that's happening right now and recognize that this is what makes him him. Now, if there's something more significant triggering you to anger, my suggestion would be identifying, why is it triggering you? Is there a reason that you should be angry based upon that dynamic? Or is it maybe based upon some past patterns of what's happened to you previously? I have a client who would go into a performance review always agitated because she'd had a bad situation previously. So all performance reviews after that were really hard for her. She was triggered. Well, we couldn't say you're never going to get a performance review because you're getting, triggered in this situation. We had to dig into understanding why she was feeling those emotions. So my best suggestion is dig in, understanding what's triggering you, why it's triggering you. Is it something that you can and should talk to that person about? And if you do, decide to do that when you are not emotionally triggered. Do that outside of the environment and let them know, my goal is to have a healthy, great relationship with you, or have the best working relationship possible. So to go about that, or in the course of that, it seems like we run into conflict when this situation happens. And I've been doing some self-awareness and recognize that, here's how I'm reacting. So it's important, as you're talking about this, you're recognizing what you can and cannot control. You're not saying to them, do this or don't do that. You're focusing on you, your behaviors, and you're bringing awareness to their behaviors and, the situation and dynamic. I know it's a really broad question, so it's hard to give a specific answer, but hopefully that helps.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. I appreciate taking the time. Everyone, I know we have so many questions, but we are at the top of the hour. Thank you again for joining us on this webinar on this great topic. And Erin, as always, thank you for sharing and presenting on this topic as well on behalf of New Horizons. With that said, please join us in 2020. This is our last webinar for 2019. We hope to have everyone join us again and maybe join another session that Erin's going to be leading. So with that said, have a wonderful holiday, everyone, and you may now log off. Thank you again.